Good evening, brethren. Good to see everybody that's here tonight. If you want to, you can be opening your Bibles up to Daniel, the 8th chapter. As we've been moving through the book of Daniel for the last couple months, we'll be looking at the 8th chapter tonight, which, in my opinion, for what it's worth, is the easiest of the chapters involved because we're just told what it means. So not a whole lot of speculating and not a whole lot of guesswork when the angel Gabriel's kind enough just to lay it out there for you. We looked at the first division of the book of Daniel, which is the first 6 chapters, and enumerated each one of those. Now we're in the last half of the book. We looked last week at the vision of the 4 beasts, which we said was very much in tune with what was seen in chapter 2 with the dream Nebuchadnezzar had of the great image. This week we'll be looking at the vision of the he-goat and the ram. Next week, the 70 weeks, or actually a couple weeks off, got singing next week, and then the vision of the heavenly messenger, chapter 10. Chapter 11 will be the vision of the king of the south and the king of the north, which will be a little clearer at the end of tonight's lesson, and then the vision of the end. Chapter 8, verse 1 begins, "In the 3rd year of the reign of the king of Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me." And once again, we're brought to the stark reality that the book of Daniel, of course, is not chronologically arranged, because in Daniel chapter 5, if you remember, we saw the death of Belshazzar. Yet last week we looked, he's very much alive, and this week he's very much alive. So don't let that confuse you. But in the 3rd year of his reign, Daniel's going to receive this vision. "Even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared first unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass that when I saw that I was at Shushan," and some people are speculating whether or not he was physically at Shushan or in the vision he was at Shushan. It doesn't really matter. But he says that he's in Shushan at the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and he saw a vision, and he was by the river of Eli, or what Ulai, which could be, it's really kind of like a canal. If you look at this photograph up here, you can see this map drawn out. You'll see Susa over there kind of in the bottom right-hand corner. That's Shushan. Susa, Shushan, same place. And so he's over in probably an eastern part of the Persian kingdom. And so that's where he's saying this vision in his head is taking place, or where he's at physically. And, of course, you can see Babylon is, of course, further to the west. But this is where he says the vision occurs. He said, "I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up at last." Just your standard ram, except his horns seemed to actually come out of his head while Daniel's looking, and one is larger than the other. And most speculate, and I think rightfully so, and Gabriel's going to say the same, this is the kingdom of Media and Persia. It's no doubt that the Persian part of the Medo-Persian Empire was always stronger than the Medes part. The Persian Empire was just larger. It was just larger and stronger militarily. And so that's what most people, and I think the angel is going to even say that that's the case. Verse 4, "I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward." This ram he is the top dog on the block, if you will, "so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. No one could stand, even the great kingdom of gold, which Nebuchadnezzar, the king, represented, couldn't stand before this ram." This ram is now the top dog, and he is going to reign, and no one is going to stop him for a while. He says, "And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat," literally a bull goat, a male goat, "came from the west, and on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground." Notice this thing is moving so fast, this goat that he's seeing, it's like it's not even touching the ground. It's above the ground. It's flying so quickly, and it is so strong, and it is so quick. The whole thing about the Grecian kingdom, you'll see, is just quickness. From Alexander only rules like 13 years, and he's 33 when he dies. He basically helps his dad win some great battles when he's 16, becomes king at 18, his co-ruler like at 18, and at 20, he becomes king. In the next 13 years, he just basically tears up the world. And so it's very fast that this happens. This is not something that was a slow process, but this is a goat, and this he-goat comes on, and he comes on fast. And one of the things, let me forewarn you before we get kind of into this, when you're studying about Alexander the Great, a lot of the Alexander stuff is, you kind of have to stick your tongue on the side of your cheek, take it with a lump of salt. Anybody ever heard of the Gordian knot? It was believed to have been tied by Midas, the Golden Touch fella, or his son, or his dad. Nobody really knows. But you remember Alexander the Great unties the Gordian knot. Well, what he does is actually takes his sword and just cuts the knot. And, of course, it unravels and comes apart. And whoever could untie that Gordian knot in the mythology, would rule all of Asia. And so you have a lot of that. You also have a lot of Alexander the Great stories where he goes into Egypt, and he wants to be, he's looked at as this god, and he wants to be the Amra Zeus, if you will. So you have a lot of these stories. And so you just kind of have to take what you can. Look what the Bible says now. The Bible is going to be, of course, true and right. But a lot of these outside secular histories, they're just going to be kind of exaggerated, and they're usually written from one side's perspective, None of the Persian wars we'll talk about tonight, there's no record in the Persians about what happened. They just didn't write about it, maybe because they were, taken over. But the Greeks, and, when you're the winning side, the old story goes, the winning side writes the history, and that's exactly what you find with the Greek Empire as well as the Roman Empire. So just when you're doing your reading and stuff, and let me recommend some things. The next few weeks, we're going to be about a month, more, maybe a little bit longer, in this last section of the book of Daniel. Years ago, there was a man who was very influential in my life. It was Stephanie's, actually it was an uncle, but we always looked to him as a grandfather because her mother was so, young among all the siblings. And one of the books, he had a good library. He was an elder in the Lord's church for many years. And one of the books that he gave me, I had no idea why he gave me this book. I was like, and it was an old book, and you could tell he had well read it. This is not it. This is my own copy that I later on bought, and I have yet a second copy. I have 3 copies of this. One he gave me, one that I bought and read, and then I have another hard copy. But this is the complete works of Josephus. Now, if you know anything about Josephus, he was a military general. He was a leader when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. And so him and some other fellows kind of holed up in a cave, and the Romans were going to kill him. And so they kind of took lots, and, 40, 1 was going to kill 2, 2 was going to kill 3, 3 was going to kill, 4, and so on until they got to the number 40. Well, I guess Josephus and his buddy were 39 and 40 because Josephus says, you don't want to die, do you? And, of course, they didn't die. And when the Romans found him, of course, they were going to kill him. And Josephus said, no, you don't want to kill me because I've got something to tell you about your king. Our God spoke about your king. And, of course, he's going to be talking about the very things that we're looking at in the book of Daniel. As a matter of fact, in the Antiquity of the Jews on page 227, he talks about this various thing. And then at the bottom of that page, he said, in the very same manner, talking about what we're going to be talking about tonight with the Medo-Persian and Grecian kingdom, he said, in the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. So the Antiquity of the Jews, the Wars of the Jews, which is this is actually a couple books put into one. The reason I bring that up, that's what we're going to be talking about. That's the section of history that Josephus is going to be dealing with. And also, if you happen to have an old family Bible at home, perhaps one of those big table Bibles, you just may have a copy of the Apocrypha inside. It used to be standard, the King James Version, when it first came out, it had what we call the Apocryphal books in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. 1st through the 4th Maccabees covers this time period. If you read the first chapter of the book of Maccabees, you're going to be like, man, I've heard this my whole life. And I've heard preachers talk about this. This is where they're getting it from, and that's exactly right. The Maccabean period is going to be about 170, 200 BC to right up to almost the time of Christ. That's when the Jews were fighting for their independence. And so if you have a copy of that, it's excellent reading. It'll take you a little bit of time. It's intriguing reading. It's difficult reading. But at the same time, everything you see, you're going to say, man, I've heard that. I've read about that in other places. But you'll see that. And that's the Maccabean brothers who actually, the daddy there and his sons kind of lead a rebellion right after the time we're going to be talking about tonight with Antiochus Epiphanes, which he was the ruler of the Seleucid kingdom, as we'll see here in just a moment. I don't want to get too far ahead. But the Maccabees, that's about that. That's about the history of those men and the folks that joined with them, overthrowing off this reign and being able to be a free group pretty much until Rome ends that about 70 BC. So if you have complete works of Josephus, if you don't feel bad. If you have a computer or a smartphone or anything else, just type it in. There are buku copies on the internet. They're free. You can read them. And I highly recommend it because it's, even though it's not Bible, it's good history. It's good history. So take a look at that. This goat is so fast that he doesn't even touch the ground, and he has a notable horn between his eyes. Most of the time we think of a he-goat, a billy goat, we think of a goat with two horns, but this is a very special goat. This goat has this notable horn, and when this horn, as we're going to see here in a moment, is broken off, 4 come up in its place. And we'll talk about that when we get there. And he came to the ram, this he-goat does, who had the 2 horns. Now this ram, he had been having his way with everybody, remember? The big ram, powerful, one horn bigger than the other. Nothing can stand in his way as he goes west and north and south. Nothing can stand before him. Well, here comes this little goat out of the west, going so fast he can't even touch the ground, has this huge notable horn. And he comes to this ram that had 2 horns, which he had seen standing before the river, and run into him with the fury of his power. It says, and I saw him come close to the ram, and he was moved with choler. Now this word choler, we would probably say rage. The Hebrew word itself entails the idea of bile. And what they thought used to happen was that when you get angry and you get red-faced, which I just do when I get hot, but sometimes when you get angry and you get red-faced, they thought that was bile actually coming up from your stomach and filling your face up, making you hot. And so that's why it has this idea. We would just simply say moved with rage, great anger. And he was moved with choler against him and smote the ram. So here you have this notable horn, this one-horned goat, notable horn being Alexander, that's coming so swift, so fast, doesn't even touch the ground. And that's basically how he took place. Alexander the Great, in 3 battles, destroys the Persian Empire. You have the first battle is Granicus, which you have about 47,000 Greeks going against about 24,000 Persians with satraps as leaders. Darius III was not involved in that battle, and of course the Persians are routed. And Alexander goes everywhere doing every kind of thing. So Darius realizes he has to do something, this being Darius III, not the Darius of Scripture. So Darius III gets together and he meets Alexander again at a place called Issus. If you've ever heard of the Phalanx, then you know something about Alexander the Great's tactics. He was a great tactician. He was fearless, absolutely fearless. He would lead his own cavalry, which he had divided up into different groups himself. And his men were just so totally behind him. The dude, he thought he was God. He didn't think he could die. And so he was just, bent on doing what he could do. And he routs the entire Persian army. And one of the ways that he would do it was he would, kind of act like he was going this way, kind of like you do with a basketball, get the guy to commit his weight that way, and then he would take off in the other direction. But the guy taking off in the other direction would be Alexander leading the charge, and he would go after the king. And a lot of times, if you can get the king to turn and run, guess what you're going to do to his hired army? Because this second battle at Issus, actually you had Greek mercenaries who were with the Persians. They were paid soldiers. And of course, you can imagine what the Greek soldiers under Alexander did to the Greek mercenaries. Because there's no love lost right now between the Greek kingdom and the Persian kingdom. Have you ever heard of Thermopylae? The 300? Have you ever heard of those great, Marathon? Those battles where the Persians were simply trying to come over and take over Greece. Greece was it was the thorn in the Persian foot. They never could conquer Greece. It just didn't happen. Even when, Artaxerxes' father, who, of course, Esther's husband, led the greatest, military campaign that had ever been to that time as far as forces, they believe over 1 million-man army, he was stopped and couldn't do what he wanted to do. So Greece never surrendered to Persia, but the Persians did do a lot of looting. They did do a lot of killing. They did a lot of things that made a whole lot of Greeks mad. And so now the Greeks are over in Persia. And you know what goes around comes around. That's exactly what's happening. The third time they come is a place called Gaugamela, I guess is how you'd say it. It's the third battle in which Darius is routed. He's run from the field. Now these battles are taking place between 333 and 334 and 331 BC. Darius is routed. He has to leave the field, and his own people kill him. One of those kind of deals where we're going to do something good for the country. We're going to kill our king, and it's much better to be under Alexander and live than to be under Darius and keep fighting. So that's what they did, and Darius will be killed by his own people. But notice this ram. Smote the ram, break his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. It's just not going to happen. This he-goat is too powerful. But cast him to the ground and stamped upon him. Not just, killing him, but pulverized him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. And that's exactly what takes place. We find that he-goat that moves so swiftly, representing the Grecian Empire, just totally destroying the Medo-Persian Empire and rising up, of course, in its place. Therefore, the he-goat waxed very great. If you know anything about Alexander, at 33 years of age, he ruled the known world. He was going over into India when his army finally said, hey, look, we've got more stuff now than we can carry. We don't want to go to India. We've got everything we need. What's over in India that we want? And so they just wasn't going to go. So Alexander comes back and dies. We don't know how, but there's a lot of theories. But he dies actually in Babylon, in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. It's kind of neat. Verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And it came up, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now here's an artist's representation. This looks like something I would draw. But you have these 4 horns that come up. Notice you have the 4 kingdoms. We're going to talk about the 4 generals here in a moment. But you have the kingdom of Thrace, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt. And out of this Syrian horn, out of one of these horns is going to rise up a little horn. And this little horn is going to be the problem for the Jewish people. It's going to be the problem for the people of God. His name, of course, is going to be Antiochus Epiphanes. It says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed great, exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. In other words, this king, this little horn, is going to rule the pleasant land, or Jerusalem, the holy land of the Jewish people, the promised land. Now, remember, I told you if you could remember that acronym, CLAP. Cassander will have Macedonia, Greece. Lysimachus would have Thrace. And Seleucus, the kingdom, which we said was Antiochus, the first one, Antagonist, he will have what we'd call Syria, and then Ptolemies would rule Egypt. Now you'll notice you have these arrows going over to Lysimachus' kingdom and Cassander's kingdom, because that's what's going to happen. Now this didn't happen overnight. They just didn't get up and say, okay, you got this, I got this. This is about a 22-year period that this takes place. But this is how it basically plays out. And then as it continues to go, just like with world powers today, you have some powers that decline and some powers that grow stronger. The Ptolemies kind of held their own down in the south by intermarrying with the Seleucids. And we'll see a lot of that in the latter parts of the book of Daniel. But Lysimachus, Cassanders, they're as they die and they have people come up behind them, they don't really make it. And so basically the Seleucid Empire becomes very, very powerful. It says, and it waxed great. That's this little horn. Even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Now this period is going to be talking about this Antiochus Epiphanes, and one of the reasons that you might want to look at the 1st, 2nd, 3rd chapters of the book of 1st Maccabees is because that's exactly what is taking place. You won't believe some of the horrendous things that Antagonus did. One of the things he did that you've probably heard before was in the very same block. In the very same block of the temple in Jerusalem, he built a gymnasium, a Greek gymnasium, because he really was caught up with the Greek culture. Remember one of the things Alexander did? He just didn't go and take over things. He wanted to leave this Hellenistic, the Greek culture. He wanted to not only make everybody, under his power, but he wanted to make them little Greeks, kind of like Manifest Destiny with the United States, Wanted to make everybody Greeks. You had all these little Greek city-states he set up, cities, kind of like Alexandria. And they would become heartbeds of learning, and they would have a great influence. And Antagonist is going to be caught up in this very thing, and he wants to do that. And he knows, and you had a lot of Jews that fell in with him, and that's one of the reasons God says they're going to be punished, is because they're playing right into this. They're going along with it. They like having the gymnasium down there. And by the way, if you went to the gymnasium, you worked out in the nude. That's how the Greeks did it. That's how it was done. And, a lot of people may say ain't a whole lot changed, but that was and this was in the same block. So and there were some Jews that were just absolutely so against this. Here we are, we have the holy temple of God, and in the same block you're building a gymnasium where people do this, which we wouldn't even be caught dead doing. But then you had a lot of younger Jews that were caught up in this movement to modernize, and be Western-like and to be like the Greeks. And so there was this internal struggle that was going on as well, and God is going to address that. Notice, and it came down, some to the host of the stars of the ground, and stamped upon them. This little horn is going to pull down some powerful Jewish leaders, some of the powerful people who are good people, and he's going to have his way with them, and some evil. And notice the Seleucid kingdom. It is just going to grow and it's just going to expand. And out of this kingdom is going to arise this guy. This is probably one of the most evil characters. I know when we think about evil today, you got to be Mussolini or Hitler or somebody to kind of, maybe Osama bin Laden would figure out in there. But this guy he was it. He was a very bad guy. Antiochus Epiphanes, which literally in the Greek, God manifest. That's kind of what he thought of himself. And if you can go and you can kill little babies because their mothers had them circumcised, and then kill their mamas, and then hang the little babies around their necks as a sign to everybody else, that's pretty cold. I don't know how you get much colder than that. That was some of the atrocities that took place under Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's going to be talked about quite a bit in the last part of Daniel. It says, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. That's talking about God. And by him, by Antiochus Epiphanes, the daily sacrifice was taken away. You remember, he's the fellow that went into the temple in Jerusalem and offered a pig, had his people offer swine on the altar of God. And you remember, they weren't even allowed to eat pig. They couldn't eat pork. So to take an unclean animal, even in the temple, that would just been unheard of. And then to offer it instead of what God had said, just absolutely awful. The daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now, brethren, just remember that when you're dealing with this and you see other folks on TV talk about these various passages, they do not teach this at all. They're still looking for things like this. They'll take this chapter and they'll make it even a 4. They'll talk about the Antichrist and how a lot of this is still, to be done in the future. Such is not the case, if you'll even just let the angel explain. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. Notice that. It's allowed to do. Why? The sins are the Jews are in transgression. This is going to take place. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Even the law of God is going to be forbidden in Jerusalem. Imagine that. The old covenant would be, if you found with a copy of the book of the law, you could be executed. The book would be confiscated. It would be burned. Then I heard one saint or a holy one speaking to another saint, verse 13, and said unto the certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice? In other words, when's this going to happen? And the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot. In other words, how long is this going to take place? Verse 14, and he said unto him, unto 2,300 days, which shall be then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. If you add that up, it's a little bit less than 6, or a little more than 6 years. And so unlike times and half times and 3.5, we have this indefinite amount of time, apocalyptic. This seems to be a little bit more specific. And if you go and look at when this time took, then it could be the 6 years, around a 6-year period when so much was going on in Jerusalem with Antiochus Epiphanes. And I think that's what this is leaning more towards. Not an indefinite like we have with the 3.5 or the times and a half time, but it seems to be a little more specific, if you will. Verse 15. And it came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Uli, which called and said, Gabriel. Now we know who Gabriel is. Remember, anytime you have that little EL on the end of a word, that's the word for God. That's the Hebrew word for God. And this is a servant of God. It's like Michael or Gabriel. This is going to be one of the angels that stands in the presence of God, as he'll describe himself to Mary. He says, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, Daniel says, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. In other words, as Young's commentary put it, Daniel swooned. He kind of passed out. I imagine you could imagine minding yourself being doing the same thing. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now, they're going to be the end of the Jewish people and so forth, not the end of time. Verse 18, now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at that time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So you ain't got to figure that out on your own. Gabriel tells us. The rough goat, the he-goat, the male goat, the bull goat is the king of Grecia. There again, you don't have to guess at that. God tells us. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of that nation, but not in his power. In other words, Alexander the Great, he owned it all. When these 4 generals eventually take over, they're just not going to be what he was. You can imagine dividing America up into 4. They're not going to be as great as the whole nation would be together. Notice verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, in other words, the transgressors, the Jews, says, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Bottom line is you're going to have a fellow that knows how to get things done. He's wicked as the day is long, and he knows how to make things happen, and he's not above not telling the truth. He'll do whatever it takes. He's going to come up, and he shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully or fully. And he shall prosper and practice and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. In other words, this fella is going to wreak havoc with the people of God. Now also remember, brethren, that in Jerusalem you have the people of God. Yes, you have the Jews, the promised seed of Abraham, if you will. But in the same sense, you've got a lot of wickedness too. Yes, you have folks like the Maccabees who are very zealous for the law, but you also have a lot of people who are zealous for themselves. As you'll see, even in the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, Titus was outside. He wanted the Jews to surrender. Bottom line, it was his job to take over the place. He was hoping that they would surrender. He knew what was happening if his army had to take it over. But the factions inside were fighting one another just as bad as or worse than the Romans. And they were killing each other inside the city gates. It's almost as awful and as bad as if you ever get a chance to go down to Andersonville, the Confederate prison for Union soldiers down in Georgia. And you think, oh boy, they sure were treated bad and poorly, and they didn't have a whole lot of stuff, and a lot of that's true. But some of the worst, most heinous acts that took place were done by the federal prisoners themselves. Inside the prison, they had developed cliques, if you will. And these guys would go around and take things from guys who weren't able to fight against them. It's, that might makes right kind of mentality. That's what those men had been reduced to at Andersonville. And I'm not saying that, that their situation didn't have something to do with that. But that's one of the reasons M.B. Hardeman's great-grandfather or grandfather was killed when he got there, or it might have been his daddy. They took everything. The clothing, any money they had with him. When they went inside, these marauding bands of men inside the prison were actually taking advantage. And this is all, it's written down. I'm not making this up. You're more than welcome to go and look at the plaques. But they were doing this to themselves. And it's a terrible thing. Well, that's what you find going on in Jerusalem. You have in Jerusalem internal struggles just like you do with any city, with any town, with any community. You had people who were wanting to do what's right. You had those people who were wanting to push the envelope. You had the younger Jews who were saying, hey, man, the gymnasium is the greatest thing. I can't wait to go in there and take off my clothes and run around the track, That's what they were thinking. It's great to be a Hellenist. And then you had those Jews who were saying, listen, we don't need to have this Hellenism in our city. This is the holy city of God. We have our own laws. We are a theocracy. We need to do what God would have us to do. And so you had this internal strife going on as well, and God's fixing to end all that, if you will. And so they're going to be destroyed. Copy of the law, the mighty people, the holy people of God, they're going to be run out, if you will. Verse 25, and through his policy, that being Antiochus Epiphanes, also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. He's even going to think he can stand up against God. Verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore, shut thou up the vision, for it shall be many days. Now, this is something we're talking about. It's about 160, 170 BC when this takes place. Daniel is sometime around 500 to 450 BC, maybe even a little bit later than that. So, it's about 300 years. And God's saying, that's so far off that I want you to shut it up. I don't even want you to, this is going to be many days off. We'll have this later to look at. So what does that do when you think about the book of Revelations, when people are still saying, it still hasn't come to pass, when Jesus said it shall shortly come to pass, that which he's talking about in the book. You can see how that's much further. 2,000 years is far more than, of course, this is just being 300 years out. Verse 27, Daniel says, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days." And you might say, why did this make him sick? This is his people. This is his country. Now, you know, Daniel has been out of country his whole life since he was just a young person. And so, but he's reading what's going to happen to his people. He's reading what's going to happen to his country. Imagine us getting a vision of God where he tells us some tragic event that's going to happen in Tennessee, or some tragic event that's going to happen to the Southeast, or even to the United States, and we have to read about that. It would cause you to feel pain. It would cause you to feel bad. He says, "Afterward I rose up and did the king's business." You know, I did my job, and I was astonished, but it was something I still thought about and still speculated on, and was just marveled by this, Daniel said, at the vision, but none understood it. Daniel said, I didn't really understand. I know what God was telling me. I know what he was saying. You can't help but think Isaiah and some of those Old Testament prophets that were penning, the very words that God was giving them, were thinking to themselves, "Well, I'd like to know more about that." I sure would like to know more about Isaiah 53, for instance. Can you imagine Isaiah scratching his head and saying, you know, I sure would like to know more details about what's going on? That's exactly what Daniel's saying here. God has showed him what's going to take place, and yet there's so many questions, so many things that he'd like to know. The children of God were going to be going through some difficulties, no doubt about it, some difficult times. This prophecy's for them, because just like the book of Revelations and some of the things we're going to see at in the end of the book of Daniel, God wins. God is always in control, and sometimes it looks as if he isn't. Don't you know when they built that gymnasium right there on the same area as where the Temple Mount was, people were going, "Man, what's happening? I mean, what is happening? Is God not in control anymore? I mean, here's his holy temple, and right over here is this Hellenistic gymnasium where people are doing all kinds of wicked things. This is terrible. Where's God? Is he not listening to us?" You can almost hear the laments of David in the Psalms. "God, how long will we cry, and you will not hear us? How long will we continue to petition, yet you will not bend your ear toward us?" So we can sympathize and look at that and take courage from the fact that in our day, brethren, some things have changed. And there's some things that are definitely not good. I wish they were different. I sure do, and I do everything that I can to the people that I know to encourage them to help me to encourage people to make it different. But we're not running around with little dead babies on our neck. We're not having our Bibles taken away from us and destroyed and burned. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we can look at and say, you know, it's not near as bad as in the time of Daniel's prophecy. It's not near as bad as it was in the Revelation. And if it was, God is still in control. Don't forget that. As we look at these prophecies in Daniel, yes, they can be very confusing. I think it was Walker last week met me at the back door with his eyes crossed going, "What were you doing to us?" You know, some of these can be like that. But don't let it bother you. Just realize this is written to encourage you that God is always in control, no matter what Jehu may be running around trying to do some things that he shouldn't be doing. This prophecy was for them, just like the prophecy in the book of Revelation is for the 7 churches of Asia and Christians in the first century, as well as for us today. Just as Revelation was a book written to comfort, it was also a book designed to warn. Look, it's going to be tough. And what does Paul tell us? If any of us are going to be a Christian, what are we going to suffer? You're going to go through some persecution. Maybe not at the level that the Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes, maybe not at the level that the Jews would in AD 70, or even the children of God, the Christians in the first century in the Roman Empire. But you're going to go through some discomfort. Just remember, as you're going through those things, that other people have gone through the same thing, and they've come out on the other side victorious, and you can too. If you're here tonight, not a New Testament Christian, let me encourage you to obey the gospel of Christ. That is where true victory is. Can you imagine going through all these terrible things that Daniel was talking about because you deserved it? Because you were one of those people in Jerusalem running around naked in your gym clothes and, you know, would try to be a Jew too, and at the same time doing all these other things, going down to the temple of Zeus and offering up sacrifices because, you know, hey, their religion is just as good as ours and all those kind of ideas that's even espoused today by some members of the church. It was there. You know, that's always something you have to be wary of. God, and then imagine going through that persecution because you deserved it. It's different when you don't deserve that persecution. That's what Habakkuk's argument would be. Hey, look, Lord, we may be bad, but we're not as bad as those guys. God says, I'm going to take care of them too. You want to be on the side of God. You see, heaven is a place that's designed for prepared people. It's a place that's designed for you.
It's where human beings are supposed to go. Men's souls are supposed to go to heaven. Hell wasn't designed for your souls, not designed for men. It was designed for the devil and his angels, yet men that are wicked and don't obey the gospel. That's what exactly 2 Thessalonians 1, 7 through 9 tells us is going to happen to those people. Don't want to go there. Don't want to be a part of that. Let me encourage you to put on Christ. Be a child of God. If you're not faithful, come home. If there's anything that we can do for you, we ask that you come as together we stand and sing.